Welcome to Mrs. Booth's Flipped Classroom, 5th grade ELA. Today we'll be reading Winter the Huntsman and Falling Snow, and we're preparing to discuss figurative and literal language when we come to class. Okay, so today we're going to be looking at Winter the Huntsman by Osbert Sitwell. And we're going to go through and read. I'm going to read this to you, and I'm going to point out some things that I want you to notice that will help you be prepared when you come to class for our discussion on figurative and literal language. So let's start just by reading through once. Okay, so it's Winter the Huntsman. I'm going to move this a little bit so you can see the whole poem as I read it. Through his iron glades rides the Winter the Huntsman. All color fades as his horn is heard sighing. Far through the forest his wild hoofs crash and thunder, till many a mighty branch is torn asunder. As the red reynard creeps to his hole near the river, the copper leaves fall and the bare trees shiver. As night creeps from the ground, hides each tree from its brother, and each dying sound reveals yet another. Is it Winter the Huntsman who gallops through his iron glades, cracking his cruel whip to the gathering shades? Okay, so the first thing I want to point out in this poem is Winter the Huntsman. So this is because it's capitalized. Not only is it a title, but it appears to be the name of something. And if you notice it down here, Winter the Huntsman is also referenced again in the poem, and it's referenced again down here. So if you notice when I read, I didn't pause at the end of the sentence right here. Let me read this one again. Okay, so here's what it would sound like if it had a period or a comma. Let's put a comma. Through his iron glades rides Winter the Huntsman. Okay, and Winter the Huntsman has a period, so I would have stopped there, but that's not how it's written. It's written so that you don't pause here. So sometimes in poetry we look at this and we think, oh, that's the end of a sentence. It's not the end of a sentence, it's the end of a phrase, and it doesn't have punctuation indicating we should pause or stop. So this is how it reads. Through his iron glades rides the Winter Huntsman. The other thing that might be a little confusing is this capital letter. So that normally to us signals the beginning of a sentence, but in the case of poetry, lots of punctuation rules go out and capitalization rules go out the window, so to speak. So the same with this sentence. Now some people might read it, all color fades as his horn is heard sighing, but by not putting a punctuation mark there, the author intends to read it, all colors fades as his horn is heard sighing. That reads a lot differently than if we were to put punctuation here. So that's one of the first things I wanted to point out that I read as I read this. Now in our class we're going to be talking about parts of this poem that are figurative, okay, which means they create some kind of imagery in our mind, excuse me. And we're going to be talking about literal language, both of these, figurative and literal. So I'm going to go through and mark some of the figurative language that shows up in this poem that are really noticeable and things we're going to talk about. This is the first one that I want to talk about. His wild hooves crash and thunder. Okay, so hooves, we know we're talking about an animal, or it appears we're talking about an animal that has feet, which are called hooves in an animal. But we talk about crash and thunder. Okay, thunder, normally we think about a storm, and it brings a very vivid picture in our mind. We all know what thunder sounds like. So that's one of the first figurative language in this poem, because if it were really thunder it would be coming from a storm, but it's talking about thunder referencing the hooves. Okay, so that's one of the first ones I wanted to point out. The next one I wanted to point out is this, and the bare trees shiver. Now this is another type of language that we're going to talk about in class. Oops, and I better write this again because I'm going to run out of space. So let's do it over here. And this one's called personification. And that's assigning human qualities to things or animals or anything that's not human. So mostly we think about shivering, we think about a person, right, standing there shivering. We don't think about a tree shivering because we don't think about a tree as being human or being alive, right, to be able to shiver. So that's the other one I wanted to point out, and that's an example of personification. As we look down, we also talk about this one. This is another example. As night creeps from the ground. Now, we think about night is not a thing that can move. It's not a person or a thing that can move. So we think of things that can creep as something that can actually move. And night doesn't move, but we can imagine the night creeping from the ground. In other words, starting from the ground and working its way up. So that's another example of figurative language, not literal language. Finally, I wanted to point this out too. Hides each tree from its brother. So they're talking about the night hiding each tree. Now, we talk about tree from its brother. They're talking about the night coming up, and let's say there's a tree here. Okay. I'm not very good at drawing trees, but let's say there's a tree here and there's a tree here. And it's explaining that as the night comes, it creates enough darkness that this tree can't see this tree. But of course we know that trees don't have eyes. They can't see. So it's just trying to give an image of how dark it is as this night creeps from the ground. So these are going to be some of the things that we take a look at, and we're going to look at one more poem. Okay, so this next poem we're going to look at is called Falling Snow, and it's by an anonymous author. So let me just read through and then we'll point some more things out. See the pretty snowflakes falling from the sky, on the walk and housetops soft and thick they lie, on the window ledges, on the branches bare, now how fast they gather, filling all the air. Look into the garden, where the grass was green, covered by the snowflakes, not a blade is seen. Now the bare black bushes, all soft and white, every twig is laden. What a pretty sight! So this was very different from the last poem that we saw, although there was some rhyming in the poem from before. It wasn't as obvious as this one, because this one has an kind of an A-B style of rhyme. So this, you see if you can figure out what that is. Sky and lie, rhyme. Bare and air. Green and seen. And white and sight. So it gives a little rhythm to the poem. It's very literal, okay? Where our last poem was more figurative, this is very literal. It is explaining to you. You're thinking about snowflakes. You're thinking about them falling. You see them falling. I mean, I can almost draw this. That's how literal this is, right? So I have this little house. I see the snowflakes falling. And then I know that they're going to make this big, thick pile of snow on top. And on the window ledges, they're also going to make a pile. And on the tree branches, they're going to have a pile of snow on here as these snowflakes are falling. Then it has a garden over here that was green, but it's covered in snow now. There's no green blades of grass you can see. And the bare black bushes. Every tree has white snow on it. So this is so literal. I can picture it so clearly that I can almost draw a picture showing what this poem is trying to convey. So that's just a really brief example, and we'll talk more about it in class. Can't wait to see you there. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.